The 2009 vintage was truly special in Bordeaux. It was outstanding in Napa Valley and most of California, and there were also some terrific Super Tuscan wines from the 2009 vintage. Most of these wines are just now entering the early stage of their drinking window. So our tasting group got together and did a tasting with 6 outstanding wines that are made from Bordeaux varietals from the 2009 vintage. So in this video, I'm going to discuss the results of that tasting and give you my thoughts regarding each of these wines. Our tasting group meets maybe once a quarter or so, so when we are able to get together, we make it count and try to assemble a pretty strong lineup. And I think we succeeded quite well for this tasting. There was an outstanding Bordeaux, namely the 2009 Pichon Longueville Comtesse de Lalande. There were 2 tremendous Super Tuscan wines, the Ornellaia and Sassicaia, and there were 3 wines from California. One of them was the iconic Ridge Monte Bello, and the other 2 were from Napa Valley, namely the Spottswoode Reserve Napa Valley Cabernet Sauvignon and the Kapscandy Roberta's Reserve. We opened these wines and poured them in the glasses about 2 hours before we started the tasting, and then we enjoyed some other wines while we were waiting for these to open up. That seemed to be about right, as the wines did keep evolving a little bit, but not so dramatically that it would change the order or the rankings for a particular wine. And we tasted all of these wines single blind, so everyone knew the wines that were being tasted, but did not know which wine was which. With that by way of background, we're ready to discuss each of these 6 wines, and I'm going to discuss them individually in turn from worst to first. So be sure to stick around until the end, because the wine that won this tasting is truly special. And if you've had any recent experience with the 2009 Bordeaux blend, please share your thoughts in the comments below. The 2009 Ornellaia is a Bordeaux blend that consists of around 52% Cabernet Sauvignon, a little bit more than 20% each of Merlot and Cabernet Franc, and 5% Petit Verdot. I was really excited about trying this 2009 Ornellaia, and particularly about comparing it head-to-head with the 2009 Sassicaia. I had this 2009 Ornellaia a few years ago, and it was extremely impressive. And it also has more of an opulent, fruit-forward profile, whereas the Sassicaia can be a little bit more austere. And so I thought that would definitely be a good battle. And I also wanted to see how this Ornellaia would compare to some of the more vibrant, fruity Napa Valley wines. Sadly, however, there was a problem with the bottle. It was not as expressive as it should have been, and I knew it was going to be a problem as soon as I smelled it for the very first time. This wine did not have the opulence and the flamboyance and the expressive fruit that you would expect from an Ornellaia with 15 years of age on it. Rather, it had very muted fruit, and the fruit that was there was a bit pruny and dried out. It did rally somewhat over the course of the evening, and about 4 hours later, you could tell the fruit was struggling to come out. It definitely was not cork taint, but it may have been a little bit of oxidation or perhaps some heat damage. Worse yet, we did have a potential alternate bottle of the Ornellaia ready and waiting to go, but we tried a Coravin pour out of an abundance of caution before we just opened it. We were definitely ready to swap it out if this second bottle was better than the first. Unfortunately, however, it was exactly like the first and suffered from the same problem that plagued the first wine. So for whatever reason, this was just not an Ornellaia night. Despite the fact that it was founded in just the year 2000, Kapscandy already has a very strong record of producing some extremely high-quality Napa Valley wines. The fruit for Kapscandy's wines comes from the historic State Lane Vineyard, which was once owned by Beringer. The 2009 Roberta's Reserve consists of 96% Merlot and 4% Cabernet Franc. We definitely wanted to have a Merlot-dominant Bordeaux blend in this tasting, just to see if we could pick it out and also to keep things interesting. This wine was certainly well received by the critics who reviewed it. This wine spent about 20 months maturing in 90% New French oak. We were definitely able to tell that this was the Merlot in the bunch. There was definitely a different fruit profile for this wine, had a little bit more red fruit, and the fruit was also softer and a little bit more round. The tannin profile was different as well, as the tannins were a little bit more silky and velvety than the tannins for the Cabernet Sauvignon dominant wines. On most nights, this wine would have been wine of the night, and it was showing quite well, and as it should have been. One or two people may have had this wine fourth, but I thought it was fifth, primarily because it lacked the complexity of some of the other wines in the group. This was just a really formidable lineup, and it's certainly no shame to come in fifth when you look at the wines that finished ahead of it. Going into the tasting, I actually thought that the wine that came in fourth would be one of the front runners and probably one of the favorites for wine of the night. Among other things, this is based on the fact that it just received a 100-point score 3 or 4 years ago from Wine Advocate. The Spottswoode Estate Napa Valley Cabernet Sauvignon has been an outstanding wine for decades. Located in St. Helena, Spottswoode has been a very high-quality producer of Napa Valley Cabernet Sauvignon since it was founded back in the early 1970s. While this wine is labeled a Cabernet Sauvignon, it's actually a Bordeaux blend, but it has about 95% Cabernet Sauvignon, 4% Cabernet Franc, and 1% Petit Verdot. This wine was definitely a classic Napa Valley Cabernet Sauvignon. It had flavors and aromas such as blackberry, blackcurrant, tobacco, cedar, and spice. Surprisingly, however, there was less acidity for this wine than some of the other wines that finished ahead of it. The fruit for this particular wine just wasn't as expressive and vibrant as for the wines that finished ahead of it. When coupled with a slightly lower acidity, this wine just seemed a little bit flat and it didn't really stand out or pop as much as the top three. So now we're getting into the top three, and the top three definitely distinguish themselves quite significantly from the bottom three. In fact, the second and the third wines were almost interchangeable, and it was pretty much a pick-em between those two. And if I had to score them on a 100-point system, I would probably give them both the exact same score. If you're interested in wine recommendations, wine collecting strategies, and learning more about wine, please do subscribe to my channel. I've been collecting wine for more than 15 years and also have a level 4 diploma from the WSET. So I have both formal certification as well as substantial practical knowledge from the School of Hard Knocks. But for purposes of this video, I'm going to discuss the Tenuta San Guido Sassicaia next. While this wine started out as a lowly table wine in terms of its classification, it now has its very own DOC, the Bulgari Sassicaia DOC. According to the regulations for the Bulgari Sassicaia DOC, this wine has to be at least 80% Cabernet Sauvignon and mature for 2 years prior to release, 18 months of which must be in oak barriques. As a practical matter, this wine is typically 80 to 85% Cabernet Sauvignon. The rest is almost always Cabernet Franc, although there have been a couple vintages where they used some Merlot. This wine was rich and complex, and you could tell it would be a front runner right from the start. There was a dark fruit profile with blackberry, blackcurrant, and plum. There were also some floral notes such as violets. There were Mediterranean herbs. There were also descriptors such as leather, tobacco, and cedar. Really a lot going on and numerous discrete descriptors. An extremely impressive wine. There was definitely plenty of structure to this wine and it was full-bodied, but the tannins were fully integrated and there was definitely ample acidity as well. The finish was extremely long and complex. I also tried this wine a few months ago and it was equally impressive that night. So definitely a very consistent wine as well, as both bottles have been on fire both nights. The wine that came in second was just reviewed by James Suckling about 1.5 years ago in January of 2023, and at that time Mr. Suckling gave this wine a 98-point score. In this instance, I think that score was well-deserved and is not inflated at all. In fact, I would probably give this wine a 98 as well. This is the iconic Ridge Montebello. The 2009 vintage of Ridge Montebello consists of 72% Cabernet Sauvignon, 22% Merlot, and 4% Petit Verdot. To be fair, I should probably mention that there was a bottle of this wine that was opened earlier in the night and was corked. But fortunately, the person who put this bottle in the lineup replaced it with another bottle, which was absolutely stellar. If you're not familiar with Ridge, the Montebello vineyard is located high atop the Santa Cruz Mountains, 2,300 feet above sea level. The fruit that goes into this particular wine comes from vines that are extremely old. They average more than 60 years of age. Ridge Montebello is an extremely age-worthy wine. In fact, this wine is in the very, very early stages of its drinking window and still has at least another 2 decades of life ahead of it. The fruit is incredibly youthful and vibrant, but yet extremely complex at the same time. This wine featured a beguiling blend of descriptors such as blackcurrant, cedar, tobacco, soy sauce, balsamic, and much more. Every time you came back to it, you could detect something else, but yet it had the distinctive Ridge Montebello flavor profile. When I first get presented with a lineup like the 6 wines that we had tonight, which I was assessing single blind, I like to go through them and nose each of them just to kind of get a preview on what to expect. When I got to this wine, I knew that it was either the Ridge Montebello or the wine that came in first. Interestingly, the wine that was the wine of the night had pretty much the exact same composition or varietal breakdown as the Ridge Montebello. Specifically, this wine had 75% Cabernet Sauvignon, 20% Merlot, and 5% Petit Verdot. But the Pichon Longueville Comtesse de Lalande, which I'll call Pichon Lalande for short, was absolutely the class of this lineup and was the unanimous choice for wine of the night. I also tried this wine about a year ago, and it was incredible that night as well. To put this wine in context in terms of Pichon Lalande's recent history, the 2009 vintage comes 3 years after the acquisition by Louis Roederer, so there had been some improvements made to the vineyards and the winery before this vintage was produced. But the current winemaker, who's taken the wine to even greater heights, was not yet producing the wine at that time. If this wine were reevaluated by some of the critics today, I'm quite confident that the scores would be much higher than they were the first time around. This wine is aging incredibly well. While it's in a terrific place now, it certainly has a long life ahead of it as well, and there's definitely no rush to enjoy it. But if you have multiple bottles, there's certainly no harm in checking in on it and enjoying one of them in the near term. This was a rich, seductive, opulent wine with layer after layer of intensely concentrated red and black fruit. There was so much going on here, I almost lost track. But certainly flavors and aromas included blackberry, black cherry, plum, red cherry, tobacco, whetstone, earth, mixed spice, and so much more. At some point, I just stopped keeping track and just enjoyed it and took it all in. While in my wine collecting videos, I mention how I very rarely buy more than 3 or 6 bottles of a particular wine, I was actually fortunate in retrospect that I actually purchased a case of this wine, and this was the first bottle that I opened from it. So I'm pretty well stocked on this wine, but if I was not, I would definitely be a buyer in the secondary market. This wine is just now entering the early stage of its drinking window, so it's ready to go pretty much as soon as you acquire it, but it will also age effortlessly for another 15 to 20 years in your cellar. So it's definitely a great time to be a buyer of this wine, and compared to other wines of this caliber, it's definitely a relative value, and it looks like it's selling for around $300 per bottle in the secondary market. Pichon Lalande is absolutely one of my favorite producers, and they've taken their quality to a whole new level in more recent vintages. If you'd like to learn more about this world-class producer, please be sure to check out this video that's linked above.